Hello, good morning to those joining us. Welcome to the final session of the Local Government Capacity Centre's Winter Learning Programme. Just give people a few minutes to join. Hello, good morning everyone, if you're just joining us. Hello everyone and welcome to the final session of the Local Government Capacity Centre's 2024 Winter Learning Programme. We're just letting people join us and we're going to give people a few minutes just to get logged on. While we'll do that, if we could have the next slide, please. Can't see that next slide, but I'm assuming it's come up. So if while we're waiting here for people to join, if you could answer the poll question on your screen, which is please rate your understanding of the topic from 1 to 5, with 1 being very little understanding and 5 being an expert. So you should be able to see the poll on your screen now. If you can just click one of the options and submit. If you have any problems accessing or responding to the poll, you could try just leaving the meeting and rejoining it, or alternatively, post your score in the chat. Good morning to everyone. Anyone who's just joining us just slightly late, and we're just waiting for everyone to get logged on. And on your screen, you should be able to see a poll. If you could contribute to that, that'd be great. So we've got about 160 responses so far. That's just creeping up a bit. So if you can just respond to the poll, and if you're having any troubles with that, just put your score in the chat. That'll be great. Thank you. Okay. Great. Looks like we've got quite a decent response there. So looking at the scores on screen, they were kind of in the middle ground there. At 2 and 3 in terms of your understanding. So hopefully by the end of the session we'll have boosted that and brought that up. So that's great. Okay. Thank you very much for contributing to that. We will we'll move on. And it's 2 minutes after 11 now, so we will get started. Thank you very much. Okay, next slide, please. Good morning, my name is Adam Chapman. I'm Planning Enabling Manager here at Homes England. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2024 Winter Learning Programme. This year's programme offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you've told us are important to you. Today's session is on planning, governance and decision making. Before we hear from today's guest speakers, I'll quickly take you through some housekeeping and the timetable for today's session. Can we have the next slide, please? Please could you mute and turn off videos when speakers are presenting? This should be done for you, but please ensure both are turned off. Thank you. Post any questions and comments you have in the chat throughout the session, We have people on hand to answer, and if you could like the questions in the chat that you'd like answered in the Q&A towards the end, it will help us prioritise what we ask our speakers. There will be a few more polls during the session, so please do get involved. We'd love to hear from you. Towards the end of the session, we'll be asking for some feedback, so if you could stay with us for just a few minutes after the Q&A, that would be great. In the next couple of days, a copy of the slide deck with a post-session survey will also be emailed out to you. As I said before, if you have any technical issues, please raise them in the chat and a member of the team will try and help you. Today's session is approximately 90 minutes long, and we're pleased to welcome partners from local government, colleagues working across the housing, placemaking and regeneration sectors. Could I have the next slide, please? This slide just kind of explains to you a little bit about the Winter Learning Programme, and it's brought to you by the Local Government Capacity Centre. This slide summarises who we are and what we do. We develop, curate and design well-structured offers for local government and their partners to increase skills and capacity, drive regeneration and housing delivery to help create high-quality homes and thriving places. The centre was established following extensive research and consultation across local government and a range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. Next slide, please. Okay, we should have the agenda on screen at the moment. I think my slides are running a little bit slowly for some reason. But hopefully you can all see the correct slide there. So on screen, you'll see a breakdown of today's session. Sean Coghlan from Homes England's Head of Town Planning will give us a Homes England perspective on planning, governance and decision making. Anna Rose, Head of Planning Advisory Service at the Local Government Association, will also talk to us about the role of officers and councillors at Planning Committee. And finally, Richard Schofield, Chief Planning Inspector at the Planning Inspectorate, will discuss how you can keep decisions local. We'll then have a short Q&A and draw the session to a close with some quick poll questions asking for your feedback. Okay, I'm now going to hand you over to our first presenter, Sean Coghlan. Sean, over to you.
Good morning. My name is Sean Coghlan. I lead Homes England's national planning team and act as its head of profession. I'll give you a quick overview of Homes England's perspective on the importance of effective planning, governance and decision making to our role in the agency. Next slide, please. We are the government's housing and regeneration agency. We deliver quality homes and look to improve people's lives in that context. We make this happen by using our powers, expertise, land capital influence to bring both investment to communities and get more homes built. As an agency, we have overarching objectives to accelerate the pace of housing regeneration across the country, form partnerships between the public and the private sector to bridge that gap, champion creation of sustainable homes, communities and places, and support a more resilient, diverse housing sector. Next slide, please. Planning is key to our interventions, and key to that is gaining planning certainty, whether we are unlocking land for regeneration housing through acquisition, site restoration, forward funding infrastructure, or supporting the release of public sector land, whether we provide loans to the private sector for development finance or forward funding infrastructure to support growth of new entrants, SMEs and innovators, or whether it's providing grant for infrastructure to local authorities, affordable housing grant to housing associations for that additionality. Effective governance and decision making, giving that planning certainty to the agency, is a key component that runs through all our interventions. Without that, like any body within the development and land industry, it is difficult for us to drive that investments with confidence. Next slide, please. Our new strategic plan, launched in the summer, had a wider focus than our previous plan, driving regeneration, housing delivery to create high quality homes and thriving places, supporting the government's levelling up agenda. 5 interconnected objectives, focusing on place and homes, creation of vibrant, successful places, homes that people need in the right quantity, the right type, the right tenure, supporting high quality homes in well-designed places and driving sustainable quality through both in that regard. And you can see from all those key objectives that the role within the planning system and our driving our land and development agency through that is key to our new plan. Next slide, please. I'll just use a few case studies to show the importance of effective governance in the shaping and delivery of some of our key projects. Next slide, please. York Central, one of the largest regeneration sites in the UK. We've used extensive funding to enable infrastructure to unlock this major brownfield opportunity, 2,500 homes alongside commercial and retail space. This has been driven forward with a strong partnership working in robust governance with partners Network Rail, York City Council and National Railway Museum to create in effect effective decision making at every level, whether it's through strategic boards, whether it's through working groups. In that context, those mechanisms have been set in place and they have been informed through the planning process with significant and ongoing community engagement to shape plans along the way, and that helps inform that local context and confidence to the communities that we are building within, that golden thread is there. And through that process, York is underpinned by a comprehensive vision and master plan where the planning consents all run and drive through and help reinforce that effective governance. Next slide, please. Lee Castle, North Worcestershire, near Kidderminster. We work closely with the local authority on this particular site to promote it through the local plan, which was key as we were seeking the release 103 hectares of greenbelt land surrounding the former hospital site. You can see there we were successful in getting an adopted plan in 2022. So driving that forward is fundamental to our subsequent intervention forward flooding infrastructure to drive that delivery of the 1,400 homes. Shaped again, significant community engagement. A landscape-led master plan, one of the first sort of building for nature accredited schemes in that regard. I think of today I've seen reported blue-tailed dragonflies not seen in Worcestershire before in some of our supporting blue and green infrastructure within that site that's sort of driving that. And it was shortlisted for a housing design award within that context. Next slide, please. Burtree Garden Village, new sustainable community near Darlington, part of the government's National Garden Village programme. On this particular site, its promotion taken forward was seen to be unviable to deliver to the market. A number of different land ownerships, significant upfront costs. We intervened in this site with acquisition. We partnered with the local SME developer and the local authority as landholders in both contexts. Set up a strong working relationship. Again, it needed robust and effective governance set up from day one with appropriate boards and working groups to ensure that decision making was consistent up and down the various bodies with people empowered. This enabled our £43 million of forward funding of infrastructure, blue and green, to help drive that development forward. We're working through the present planning consenting process, but have developed a very positive relationship with the authority. The scheme will deliver public park and nature reserve, and over half of the 307-acre site will be down to that blue and green infrastructure. Next slide, please. Brookley is another example of us acting in our master development role here to drive forward a mixed-use community of 3,500 homes. Again, this site has previously was stalled with multiple landowners, demonstrating a sort of coordination failure. So as a government agency acquiring land, we set up a comprehensive delivery place-based strategy, and with a programme of forward funding significant infrastructure, policy compliance scheme, 30% affordable housing, new schools, community facilities, parks, again, extensive open space, landscape led. We secured outline approval 2019, moving forward to further approvals. Shared, in this particular case, like other examples, inclusive community engagement strategy from the start helps build that confidence locally. Very good relationship with the local authority, strong and effective governance with key local authority senior staff, strong relationships there. And in this particular case, we're committed to delivering new habitats. Prior to the mandatory BNG, we'd secured a 10% biodiversity net gain through the Section 106, but predicted through the scheme is a 23% biodiversity net gain prediction through that. So its aspirations are far higher. Next slide, please. Gaining planning certainty and de-risking the sites and effective decision making are what we see as the key to delivering complex and often sensitive major developments. To gain that certainty, we always advocate setting up clear governance structures with clear terms of reference for all stakeholders to ensure the right senior representatives are there to make decisions at each level, whether it's on strategic project boards or whether it's on steering groups and working groups within that context. It is important that is in place and understood to ensure decisions can be effectively taken, escalated solutions can be sought within that context. We have a commitment to work in partnership to positively support local governance and decision making with all partners at local level, very collaborative within that context. And we are passionate about embedding early and inclusive engagement to shape community aspirations, to take that local context with us, to give that one place approach and support driving the schemes forward. We as an agency, as you've seen through our strategic plan and these examples, promote the highest levels of sustainable quality, placemaking and policy compliance schemes, most notably on the affordable housing side. That is a key driver for us. And we always work in collaboration to find local solutions at all stages. And we only really appeal as a very, very last resort when we have no other options available in that regard. Thank you for listening, and it's over to Anna. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Anna Rose, head of the Planning Advisory Service, and I'm going to talk you through the knotty subject that is planning committees. Next slide, please. So, planning committees, decisions that are made in a public arena. Planning committee is often the most public of all the meetings in the council. If there's a big application going, you can have crowds, literally crowds, in the chamber and outside of the chamber. Councils have to put up TVs to show the audience outside of the council chamber. It's very public. And the councillors who are on show at these meetings, making the decisions, that's their job, and they have to apply for that job. every few years. So in that context, next slide, please. Why do we have them? I've been in lots of meetings with different sectors, not just local government. And often the response to what can we do about the planning system is get rid of members and get rid of the public. And clearly that's not right. So why do we have the planning committees? The items that go to committee are there by exception. So they are the items that are of public interest, have received a number of representations, and you decide as a council what goes to committee through your scheme of delegation. And so we would expect at PAS that good councils should have less than 10% go into their committee. So over 90% will be delegated to officers. So the ones that go to planning committee, the applications that go there are made by councillors rather than officers. And they are in front of an audience, as I've said, and they will have a number of speakers for the items that go to committee. So it won't be just the officer's report and the officer's presentation. There will be a number of speakers for and against an application for the councillors to make a decision. The officers make a recommendation to the councillors, the members of the committee, and the councillors make that decision. And the decision is open to challenge, just like any decision in planning is. So that can be appeal, judicial review, or complaint to the ombudsman. Next slide, please. So yeah, it's totally up to the council really what decisions are made by committee, but it should be usually the larger, more complex, or those with the most public interest, because committee only really needs to deal with an application where it needs public scrutiny. We suggest that councils don't make the agendas too long. We often hear of councils going well into the night or late into the afternoon if they have daytime committees, and we always say that's unfair on everyone, the public watching, the officers and the members. And only make the decision by committee if it's in the public interest. Otherwise, leave it to the officers. That's what the delegation scheme is there for. Next slide, please. So what is good practice for the scheme of delegation? So it's really about not overloading the planning committee. So you're thinking about when it is necessary for the planning committee to make a decision and when officers can take it. So it's focusing on the important things. So a lot of councils will exclude the smaller applications, so householders, minor applications, prior approvals. And the scheme of delegation will also set out the extra scrutiny for member referrals. So for those of you who don't work in local government, it's often the case that ward members can refer to committee. So where the community are approaching that councillor about a certain application in that area, then the member is able to refer to committee. The scheme of delegation usually clarifies this so that it's not just an automatic referral to committee, but it has to be either in, it's against the officer's recommendation, or they have a cut-off time for the referral, so they can't arrive just in time for the meeting and delay everything. Also, increasing the number of representations that a planning application has to receive to go to committee can prevent the smaller applications getting through, particularly by petitions. So I think if you need to know more about schemes of delegation, the Planning Advisory Service website is full of information on this. So I won't go into it in that much detail here today. Next slide, please. So yes, what is the most important role for officers at committee? If everybody could answer, please. I will go into what PAS thinks on the next slide. yeah, I'm just looking at these come up. I get a Wordle. So yeah, so present is coming up quite strongly. Inform. Professional advice. Oh, I like a shout out for policy. That's good. Yeah. Okay. We go as everybody finished. Oh, recommendations. Yeah, we're getting more of the same now. We move on. Right, so Paz would say that you know, the officer's role is to present the facts and officer's view to members. So there will be a report that has gone to the members of the committee before the meeting, and the officer is there to present that report, the recommendation, and any updates that they need to present to the committee. You tend to try to limit the updates you make at the committee because it's new information and the members won't have had time to consider it. You explain the planning issues to the committee, and it's really about ensuring members understand those planning matters. The officer will present and usually be questioned by the committee so that they can be sure that they've understood appropriately. Answer questions of fact and give an opinion only when asked, and then guide members to ensure they make a sound decision. And when we talk about a sound decision, we mean one that will live up to a legal test, and when, if challenged, appeal will stand up to that. So, you know, we're talking about a good decision. Next slide, please. So, more importantly, what are you not there to do as an officer? You're not there to advocate for the applicant or objectors. That one, it really doesn't go down well, but it's completely inappropriate. You don't confuse members. So make your advice clear, concise, and factual, to give views where they are not needed. So unless asked, there's no need for you to give your view on any particular matter. And of course, officers aren't there to lobby members on a particular viewpoint. And it's important to remember that as an applicant, that the officer cannot lobby the members to do anything in particular. They're there to give advice. Next slide, please. So the councillor role, important to remember, and you know, when I know I'm not talking to a solely local government audience, I'm always wanting to put this in. Councillors have many roles. So of course today we're talking about their role as member of the planning committee, but they're also ward members, they could be cabinet members, and they're a political group member. Next slide, please. So at the committee, though, the councillor should only be wearing one of those hats. They should be wearing the hat of a planning committee member. Everything else is put aside. So they're there to weigh the material considerations and advice before them. They don't take any of their other roles into account at that point. Next slide, please. So duty at the planning committee is to the whole community, not just your ward, not just to the people who have objected or supported. It's for the whole community, and I think people tend to think of that as householders. It really isn't. It's businesses, it's anybody else who functions, operates in that local area, and that council, that member is there to represent all of those interests. So they have to avoid bias. People get very confused about predisposition and predetermination. So predetermination is where a councillor would say before a meeting, I'm going to vote against that application. What they're doing there is showing that they have got a closed mind. and a closed mind is subject to challenge. If they're predisposed, they might have an initial view. So they might say in a community meeting, oh, I'm not keen on this. You know, this doesn't seem to sit well with me. But if they're clear that they're going to go into that discussion with an open mind, they're willing to hear the discussion before coming to a decision, that's predisposed. And that is less likely to attract a challenge or appeal. So you can only take into account material planning considerations, so that includes precedents, previous decisions. And you base decisions on evidence, not a hunch. So this is about the test of reasonableness. So you're looking at the evidence that's presented to you and you're making a decision based on that and the things you hear in the committee. And elected representatives are not there to be experts in law or planning. They're there to represent the people. So next slide, please. So the planning committee member will listen to what the officers are telling them, and the officers are there to help councillors make those sound decisions. So a member should never feel like they're being forced to go with the officer's recommendation. It should be a free and open discussion, and the recommendation is there for them to consider. Councillors need to ask officers for their opinion before they vote. So that's why you often, if you go and see a planning committee, you'll see that they will have a discussion and they will be asking the officer questions. And they can ask the officer and the speakers usually questions so that they can come to their decision. So they need to know whether the recommendation that they're being presented with is finely balanced or clearly in conformity with an adopted policy. That's something they could ask the officer who's there. And it's important for members to know that officers are there to help councillors before as well as during the meeting. So there's nothing wrong with going and talking to the officer before the committee meeting if there's things you don't understand. Next slide, please. So planning committee members should not take the role of experts. That's not what they're there for. Even if they are a lawyer as their main occupation, they're not there to give the planning committee legal advice. There will be a representative of the council, sometimes the monitoring officer or somebody in their team who's there to give the committee legal advice. Similarly with other professions, that's not their role on the committee. They're not allowed to show bias based on their politics, geography or individuals. So this takes into account the thing about the ward member. So they can't lobby for their ward when they're in planning committee. They have to be there for the whole community of that area. Predetermined, so we've been through that. They can't make political points. You will see in a lot of committees, there are a few asides and you can probably let them drift. But political points that are influencing the decision, strictly not there to do that. And also, members are not there to avoid making difficult decisions. It is not good practice to keep deferring, referring. This is most often done for site visits, but it is usually with the more complex applications. Next slide, please. So I think this is really important. Members absolutely can make a different decision to officers. There would be no role for the committee if there was never any challenge to the officer's decision making. So they can do that, but it must be justified on planning grounds. So that's usually where the rub comes, is that the committee goes against the officer's decision and or the recommendation, but then there's there has to be that justified planning grounds with which to go against the recommendation, and the committee has to give justified planning reasons. So they have to have thought about what the planning reasons are for going against that recommendation, and a good place to start is usually your local plan or national policy when you're looking at that, because it may be subject to appeal or another challenge, and I'm sure everybody's seen, but appeals can be really, really expensive if it's not found in the council's favour, so they have to pay costs. and councils don't have a lot of money. So being on sure footing when you're going against an officer recommendation is the best way to avoid that. Next slide, please. And yeah, decision can be challenged. We've got Richard coming up next, but you know, so the appeal to either the Secretary of State or the Planning Inspectorate, possible unreasonable behaviour. So that's where you're making decisions that aren't justified by planning grounds, or judicial review and local government ombudsman. So there's a lot of a challenge that can be made against accounts. So it takes time, it takes money, and it has to be worth it. Next slide, please. So what does a good decision look like? So we think at PAS that a good decision where there's a clear officer explanation of the issues and some suggested weight to be given to each of those issues. At the committee, the member discussion is on the most relevant planning issues. So they've pulled out the most relevant ones and they've given it a good discussion. And the officers and members are working together to understand the issues and enable members to decide the weight to be given to each of those issues. So it should be a clearly argued and defendable member decision. So you have to be on solid ground. And this is where the role of the officer is really important in advising the committee. Really, the officers and members should be working together to avoid an unsound decision being made. And yeah, a good decision is not necessarily the same as the officer's recommendation. And it's worth officers, members, and external parties all being aware of that. Next slide, please. So I often think that in councils, we think that officers are in charge of improving performance, even if there's committees that go with them. And it's really important with planning to ensure the members understand the importance of performance and the role that performance has in maintaining the local decision making in your area. So for me, ensuring that the planning committee owns their performance and the possible consequences of decisions they make is really important. And this is not ramming it down the committee's neck every single meeting, but it's making them aware of how close they are to certain performance measurements that the government's got in place. Performance should always be included in member training so that they understand the measures, and including lessons learned as part of the planning committee agenda is really good practice. So reporting on peer results and identifying what went wrong or what went well so that you can learn from it is really best practice. Next slide, please. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to pass over to Richard Schofield now from the Planning Inspectorate, and I'll see you later for questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm Rich Schofield. I'm the Chief Planning Inspector at the Planning Inspectorate. I've been here for about just over 10 years. And just for a bit of context, before I joined the Planning Inspectorate, I was head of planning at a local planning authority. So I like to think that I have some degree of background and knowledge in this broad area beyond what I'm going to say on behalf of the Planning Inspectorate. So just so I endorse that everything that Anna's just said in relation to the sort of planning application decision-making process, not least as some of our slides started by duplicating content, which I think is reassuring. So it shows we're both coming at things from the same place. And I can also very strongly recommend the Planning Advisory Services. They provide a whole range of advice and information to local planning authorities, and will certainly come and visit you if you wish them to provide member training and other bits and bobs. I'm sure Anna will address that later on. But because of what Anna's covered, my focus will be on certain other aspects, and I will kick off with the local plans side of things. So if I can have my first slide, please. So as many of you are well aware, I'm sure, the Planning Compulsory Purchase Act says that the planning system, well, the framework says the planning system should be generally plan-led, but the legislation says if regard is to be had to the development plan For the purpose of any determination under the Planning Acts, that determination must be made in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So why am I starting here? I'm trying to the best thing to help you with your decision making is to have an up-to-date local plan in place. Harrogate picked here. It's one I examined several years ago and found to be sound after a lengthy period of examination. But you know, the starting point for all decision making should be a local plan. If you haven't got one, that becomes more difficult, obviously. Next slide, please. So the government's long-term plan for housing, many of you will be aware of this, I suspect. There's an increasing push for government to get local plans in place. This is a quote by my Secretary of State, Michael Gove, that there is now no excuse for local authorities not rapidly adopting ambitious plans. The more plans adopted quickly, the more homes delivered quickly, and we have created the right incentives for rapid plan adoption. Now, it's not for me to comment on the policy approach surrounding that, but there is a real willingness by ministers now to take on local planning authorities that aren't progressing their local plans and to reward, for want of a better expression, those that are actually getting plans in place, and I'll touch more on that later. So if you're not aware already, ministers have already stepped in to prevent Spelthorne, Erewash, West Berkshire and last week Mole Valley from withdrawing their plans from examination. So again, something you should be aware of. There's a very strong desire to start seeing the local plan system ramp up. Next slide, please. So why have a local plan? As I say, this is a pin slide from a few years ago, a planning inspectorate side. We've examined over 1,000 local plans at that point in time. So you know, it's far from something that's completely died a death. But the implications for not having a local plan, you know, speculative applications and increasing reliance on national planning policy for determination, this certainty issue. Residents and developers like certainty. They want to know what's going to be built where and how it's going to look and so on and so forth. Not having a local plan is unsettling for people, and it's unsettling for the development industry as well. You've got greater likelihood of maintaining a 5-year housing land supply if you have a plan in place. You know, there's some incentive there for, you know, have allocations in place. You will have an incentive to get delivering on those, which will put you at less risk of appeal. Strong policy basis for local decision making, as I've said already. You will have control over what should go where. Now, there may be material considerations that indicate otherwise, as we've touched on already in relation to the Planning Act, but certainly, you know, you will have a strong starting point from which to make decisions. Point 3 here, if you've got no local plan, then you have uncertainty of delivery, notably of housing, and an increasing likelihood of falling behind in supply, which then leads to an increasing likelihood of appeals to the planning inspectorate, and as noted just now, potentially government intervention, well, which I will touch on again shortly. And point 4, under the new framework with regards to housing supply and delivery, there's no longer a requirement on local planning authorities to maintain a rolling 5-year housing land supply if they have an adopted plan that's less than 5 years old, which has been examined by a planning inspector, and you've identified 5-year supply of sites, or 4 in certain other situations, which again is a benefit to you and a significant carrot, shall we say, to get a local plan in place. Next slide, please. So preparation of local plans, what helps, what hinders? Some of this may be teaching you to suck eggs, but for members, I'd say it's important that there's strong political leadership and championing of a local plan. Yes, it's the local authority's plan. It's not the officer's plan. It's not a political party's plan, and you should do your best not to use it as a political football, which can be incredibly frustrating for officers and for the process, and ultimately isn't particularly fair on residents. That said, obviously, officers can't be naive. You need to be remaining aware of political sensitivities, but be able to and feel able to speak truth to power. And members, you need to listen to your officers. They're advising you as best they can for you to then make a call. You may not like that. You may not like that advice, but it is made in good faith on the basis of professional judgment. Building consensus as far as possible is important, but you still need to take the tough decisions. That's what members were elected for. I see there's a question in the chat about governance of complex sites and new settlements. But and this is my point, I suppose, about making sure that the authority as a whole is open to working effectively with residents, with site promoters, with infrastructure providers, that you're trying to bring people together to create ownership of a plan that everyone can buy into. Producing good, up-to-date and clear evidence. Now, this is extremely important. It needs to be proportionate and make sure what you've got you need and it supports the approach you're taking, that it's clear. Make sure you put the time and effort into preparing that evidence before submitting the plan, which can save significant time, effort and money during the examination. If you have to halt to go away and do something else, then clearly that's going to put everything behindhand. No need to go overboard. You just need to make sure you've got what you need in place to support the proposals that you're making. And I'll touch more on how we can help, how the planning inspectorate can help with that later. The next one is easier said than done, again, for members, having good, knowledgeable planning officers and keeping hold of them. Now, I appreciate that's extremely difficult at the moment, given the state of the planning sector, but decent officers are worth their weight in gold, in my experience, both at local plan examinations and at appeals. So do invest in them and your planning service as far as you are able to, having regard to the other constraints upon local authority budgets. And I suppose my final point, I'll say this again later, but planning inspectors are there to help you get a plan in place. It's not in our interest, it's not in the planning inspectorate's interest to have plans drag out for years on end. It impacts on our resources and our time. So be open with planning inspectors, listen to their feedback. Yeah, there's no benefit to anyone bringing a plan to examination that is flawed from the start, for example, which is where we have had some recent examinations of local authorities that I won't name. I've got on for years and years because it ends up as sort of a knee-jerk reaction to an awful lot of what's being suggested by the inspector and lines in the sand that don't actually help anyone. Planning inspectorate is very happy to come and give without prejudice advice once you've reached a certain stage in the proceedings, and soon, as I'm sure some of you will be aware, that will become a fixed part of the process. The so-called gateway tests will be put in place at different stages where you'll have a planning inspector come along at different times to ensure that the plan coming to examination is as sound as it can be. And you will need to get that sign off before you can progress through the gateway and ultimately to examination. Next slide, please. So at examination, again, as I said before, the inspector's there to help you, not to obstruct the process. Their job is to get the plan sound and over the line. And as noted, my Secretary of State has asked us to do that, to be pragmatic. So the inspector will only seek changes where they're necessary for soundness, and it's better for you to work with him or her to find a way forward. So be open to change, think pragmatically, and don't be too precious or defensive about every aspect of the plan. I'm 99% certain there has not yet been a plan submitted that's not required some changes to make it sound, and you are very unlikely to be the exception to that rule. Yeah. So if an inspector is advising you in a certain way or is expressing some concerns, then again, listen to them and work with them. They're not doing it to irritate you. They're doing it because they want to get your plan over the line. Maybe something significant, it may be something reasonably small. But as I say, I've yet to see any plan that has been perfect up front. But a third point here, fronting up to issues. So again, if there's a deficiency in some of your evidence, or that a particular site has issues, then front up to it. Explain why. Explain why you think the plan is still sound or justified, or how it can be made so with main modifications. This really helps to get the issues out into the open and find a way forward. So don't try and defend. And this is equally applicable to appeals, actually. What you know is indefensible. Yeah, it just frustrates everybody. Fourth point, members, you need to be clear how far officers can propose or agree changes to your plan in an examination with having to revert back to you, whether that's to relevant cabinet member, to full cabinet, to planning committee, to full council. Even it's very rare, sadly, in my experience, but the most effective examinations are those where there's actually a well-informed and pragmatic member, perhaps the relevant cabinet member, actually present throughout to lead or support officers. The examinations are often left to the officers and you rarely see a member come in. But the most effective plans are whether you have an on the ball member who is there working with officers the whole time to get the plan through. And then finally, have a good counsel. Yes, barristers are expensive, but they can be invaluable as well. There will be representatives present with counsel from pushing additional sites or what have you, who may well make legal submissions, and you'll need somebody to address those. Your council can act as a sort of good team captain when it comes to coordinating activity, and they will likely have done this before, potentially several times, both for local planning authorities and for representatives at the examination. So they will be able to provide you with a wealth of advice on how to approach all manner of things and how to deal with the inspector's questions. So next slide, please. Now this is fairly self-explanatory. Again, the Secretary of State in his recent speech just before Christmas, I think, has asked us to scrutinise more planning decisions where a successful appeal is made against a planning committee decision and the final decision is the same as the original officer's recommendation. In other words, if an appeal comes to us as a result of members having overturned an officer's recommendation, he wants us to scrutinise that more carefully and has reminded us that where we can't find reasonable grounds, we should consider awarding costs to the appellant. Now, I did have some questions put in, some poll questions here, which I've taken out for reasons of time and because Anna addressed some of this, but hopefully that's self-explanatory. You know, just it's not new. Inspectors can still award costs and often do, but you know, the particular emphasis here on making decisions are being made, if you like, properly. Albeit, as Anna said, there is absolutely no reason at all why members can't overturn an officer's recommendation, but just be very, very clear about the basis for doing that and that the evidence you have to support that decision is clear and sustainable. So, next slide, please. So I put here perils of the appeal process, which might be a bit hyperbolic, but as I say, notwithstanding the quote I just showed you, so you shouldn't be afraid of the appeals process if you think you have a sound case supported by decent evidence, and even novel arguments are fine if you can substantiate them. So the difficulty is that we are seeing far too many appeals coming in now with spurious reasons for refusal. You know, often the kitchen sink approach is used. You have 25 reasons for refusal, which is, you know, ridiculous. Most of those are going to get struck out fairly quickly. So why do you want to avoid appeals? Well, first one is self-evident. Ultimately, it's poor planning, which, you know, for planning professionals present, I think we'd hopefully all agree with that. Neither residents nor developers, as I said before, have any sense of what may be built where. You lead to speculative development, which could be excellent, but it may be the antithesis of, you know, what your plan is trying to achieve. Second, again, I'm acutely aware of, the public sector generally, but certainly council resourcing is very tight, especially in planning departments. I speak to a lot of local planning authority colleagues, and I'm well aware of the pressures upon him. But appeals will divert resources from other proactive planning work, such as plan making, for example, and may even mean that you, potentially as a member, will have your time taken up defending an appeal if your officers had recommended allowing it, allowing the planning permission. Third, risk of costs again, and has touched on this. Appeals are costly to begin with. You have consultants, potentially barristers, you've got your staff time, and they might become even more so if you lose the appeal. For you, again, to my Secretary of State's decision above, could have costs awarded against you, which might mean that you not only end up paying the costs incurred by your council, but also for some or all of those incurred by the appellant, which can run into hundreds of thousands of pounds. The precedent issue can create a domino effect if an appeal is successful. There are plenty of firms, developers or land promoters that monitor appeal success rate in different council areas. They look to see if council reasons for refusal stand up an appeal, and if they don't, they may well decide to chuck in an appeal too. And then the issue of designation, for those of you who aren't aware of this, this is when a local planning authority's performance falls below a certain bar and the Secretary of State decides that they will become designated, and people can apply directly to the planning inspectorate for the determination of their planning applications. So at the moment, we have 3 local planning authorities, Uttlesford, Chorley and Fareham, who have lost control of some of their planning application processes, which means that the planning inspectorate is determining them. Again, that's then out of your hands. This is probably not something that makes you feel terribly comfortable. To be clear, the planning inspectorate doesn't want this. You know, it's a drain on our resources that should be directed to our core work in other areas, and doesn't help to keep decisions local. So again, just be mindful of that issue when you are taking your decisions, either as a member or as an officer. How is that going to add to your record, your tally, if you like, and what are the potential implications of you losing an appeal? And again, it's evidence of the government ministers' desire to be more interventionist in the planning process. So I think my final slide, please. So how can we help you? So PINS has historically been seen, as I'm well aware, as quite aloof and remote, which I don't think is really helpful to anyone, given that we all have an interest in getting things right the first time and making the entire process run as smoothly as possible. PINS is not just a separate part of the system. We are an integral part of this system, connected to developers, local planning authorities, government agencies, the whole 9 yards. So, we want to engage more, and I've certainly started doing that. And since taking up my role, I've been much more vocal and visible than my predecessors, as some of you might be aware. So we can field inspectors for training events, either as part of bigger programs or actually done quite a lot with the Royal Town Planning Institute, but we're also happy to send inspectors out to councils to talk with members, to talk to officers about specific matters of interest. I'm not talking about live casework by any means, but we can come out and talk broadly about planning appeals, local plans, specific subject areas like Greenbelt or heritage. So if you're interested in that, do get in touch. It's a chance to speak to a real inspector to get frank responses. So we are genuinely happy to help. I think that's probably all I want to say at the moment. So thank you very much for listening. I will hand you back to Adam, who I think will start to wrap things up.
Lovely. Thank you, Richard. We're going to move into a short Q&A session now with our speakers. So could I ask that you all come back on camera? That'd be great. I can't see you, so hopefully you're back with us. Okay. Question for Sean and for Anna, really, probably. What governance would you advise for plan makers proposing strategic site allocations with complex multiple land ownerships? And what advice do you have for how to go about setting this up? I think the context of that is garden settlements.
I'll happily pick that one up, Adam. I think I'll go first. I think quite clearly promoting those complex sites through a local plan process. If you're promoting a garden community at the very early stage, when you're sort of testing those options, it has to be set up separate to the plan making regulatory function in that context. You have to have a clear strategic board set up. Then you need to have landowner delivery group set up under that, member advisory delivery set under that, coordinated via a project steering group. But it's important to have its own governance set up to ensure that those issues can be dealt with and promoted through that context. We always advise taking some sort of legal advice within that context, but it's important to set that up properly. I don't know if Anna wanted to comment upon that.
Yeah, I think it's important to have your plan making in parallel with your discussions with the strategic site or sites. So whenever I've done this before in local government, I've always had a plan making working group and then a member group. And then I've had the strategic sites with the developers and any interested parties. So if you're in a 2-tier area, you'd have the county there. You might have, you might have other sort of Natural England, Environment Agency, the other players in that scheme. And so you'd have a chaired session with those as well, which would feed back into your working group and your member group for the local plan. So you're making sure that any of the criteria that you need in your local plan is going to cover the amount of things that the strategic site is going to put into their application. So it's teeing the two in, and quite often you will bring forward certain applications in parallel with the end point of your local plan. So especially if it's a garden settlement, if it's your main I suppose housing numbers, then you would want to bring that forward so that it was a timely delivery, and that's why you have to have the really good clear governance around it. I always suggest as well a clear project plan. with the decision points and the points at which are going to need decision from councillors, and get that all agreed up front.
Fantastic, thank you, Anna. Another question probably for you, Anna, and for Sean is, do PAS and Homes England offer any training for members on the planning system, and specifically about making robust, defensible decisions in accordance with policy? And what should members receive before taking up their position on a planning committee? What should officers and the public generally expect them to know? Sorry, that's a three-parter there.
Probably one for you, Anna, I think.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, we do offer training for members. If you go on our website, and the module is called Making Defensible Decisions, so it's exactly what you've just asked. In terms of, I go back to the bit in my presentation where I said we're not wanting the planning committee members to be experts. They're not lawyers, they're not planners. You know, they're not. That's not their role on committee. So what we're going to be training them in is a lot of what I did in my presentation, actually. What is their role? What makes a good decision? How they act at committee, and what are good things to look for. So in PAS, we often do case studies as well. So we do role plays and we test members on very complicated applications that they could come up against, particularly with land supply, which is quite tricky. And we run them through it and get them to actually act out what they would do in committee, and it's quite effective. So if you go on our website and go to the Making Defensible Decisions, then yeah, you'll see what we suggest you train on, and you can use that yourself in councils to train the committees.
Yeah, maybe pick up on that. When I was in local authority before Homes England, I often used the PAS slides to give those sessions and tailored them locally to members, and gave them those new to planning committee that member training, and then regular sort of 6-monthly or yearly updates depending on your authority. That material out there is really helpful, and you can take that and use that material through your development control managers or chief officers or anybody who wants to drive that. But it's important that members are informed. They are the decision makers at committee in that context. They are bound by the same criteria, the development plan and material consideration. So they need a understanding of that context and framework to be up to date. So really important.
Lovely, thank you both. Richard, I've got a question for you here. Could you explain designation and the Section 62A process for LPAs who have significant decisions overturned?
Yeah, so I touched on that a bit in my presentation. Well, if I start repeating myself, then please do people shout at me. But yeah, so the councils are expected to, well, there are targets for speed of decision making and the number of appeals won and lost, and the government will monitor that. And if councils get to a point where they are failing to hit those benchmarks, then they are at risk of designation. Now, the Secretary of State will enter discussion with them to see if there are particular reasons for that. And if it's not felt, or if it's felt that they're not justified, then designation can ensue. Now, we've seen, as I said before, 3 councils designated in the last sort of 2 years, which is considerably more than we've seen in the last 10, I would have said. But the process thereafter is that generally all major decisions within those local planning authorities, applicants making major planning applications have the option to apply directly to the planning inspectorate, which will usually result in a planning inspector holding a hearing to consider the merits of the case and then making a decision within the statutory time frame. We will also offer pre-application advice to applicants as well. But the council's role in that is sort of nugatory insofar as they will be present at the hearing, but it's, you know, their ability to determine that application goes out the window. And until the government's satisfied that council's got some sort of improvement plan in place and is showing improvement in its performance, whether that's, I don't know, getting Section 106 agreements in place more quickly, or its minor applications proceeding more effectively, then we will continue to determine those applications. I mean, just by way of, I suppose, context, so in terms of Uttlesford, I think the planning inspectorate I think we've determined about 16, 17 major applications so far, and we've got probably the same number in the wings, either in process or waiting to come through. So in the past, applicants have been reluctant to use that process for various reasons, but we've seen quite a significant shift in that desire. So hopefully that's clear. If not, I can put some links in the chat as to where people can find more information. But
Great, lovely, thank you, Richard. And I've got a further question, perhaps for Sean and Anna here, is what is the view of councils making decisions on applications that have made themselves, kind of such as large regeneration schemes? Can those decisions ever be free from bias, and when the council is making the decision themselves?
Want to put that one
You
up,
want me to
Anna?
go first, Sean, or are you
Yeah,
going?
yeah, I can top up here.
So what I would normally do is have a clear smoke screen between the decision makers and the client team at the council. So the worst situation would be to have your cabinet member who's in charge of the development of that site sitting on your planning committee. That wouldn't work. Similarly, you don't want your lead officer for planning being in charge of that scheme. You need a clear screen between the two, and they have to be kept separate, and the decision maker then can make their decision without it being hampered, and the development can be client side with different people in the council. I think in that respect it can be unbiased. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, it's true. I think when I always stress the difference between the executive and the regulatory function of the planning committee. So, for example, if you had your sort of development control manager who's in charge of advising members on the planning committee side, you keep them out of that context. So the LPA function versus the executive is crystal clear. And like with all these complex interwoven regeneration proposals, there is always balance in there. You've always got positive policies that look for economic development and which align with your local plan and your strategic growth for your corporate plan. So at the end of the day, from a planning decision point of view, as Anna says, you just make sure there's those barriers in place. So when people looking in and looking out, you can clearly articulate that the planning decisions based on the planning merits of the application, the development plan, the material considerations, of which is that process to go through. And that decision on a complex application will be made by the planning committee, which is regulatory function separate from the executive. And you've got enough checks and balances in place to take that forward. Naturally, for something so significant, there are overlaps, but it's just having that, having those processes in place can help protect all concerned as well in that regard.
Lovely, thank you both. Richard, I've got one more for you here. So what would trigger PINS, the government, to start looking at local authorities more closely when it comes to slow delivery of a local plan?
Well, partly it's not for me to say, but I mean, certainly, well, where a local planning authority is not keeping up with its local development scheme, that will always concern us. And then PINS has quite close contact, regular contact with LPAs, which we know are working on plans and proposing to submit. So if that starts slipping, that will give us cause for concern. Where local authorities want to suspend an examination, for example, or want to suspend the exam making process, or the biggest concern really, and that has given rise to some of the intervention by ministers, is where local planning authorities are proposing to withdraw plans from examination or not to submit them. So that's likely where the intervention will come in, particularly where they are for what are regarded as small p political reasons by the local authority rather than sound planning reasons. So I think making sure your LDS remains up to date, making sure that you have very good reasons for slowing down or potentially stopping plan making, but anything that will prevent a plan being put in place in a timely fashion will start to pique the interest of the ministers and indeed the planning inspectorate, particularly in areas that haven't had a local plan or an up-to-date local plan for a long time. You know, that's the biggest area of concern for some of the reasons that I set out before. And there are quite a number of local planning authorities that fall into that space. I can't really be more specific than that, I'm afraid. There are other factors around it that it's probably not appropriate for me to go into as a civil servant. But
okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you for your honesty there. Okay, I think now that kind of draws most of the questions to a close. So we'll kind of end our Q&A now, and we will just move on. If I could have the next slide, but thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so the slide on the screen now just gives you some kind of take-home messages that our speakers today have provided us with. So there's some really useful links on there and a bit of advice. So we will send you the slide deck separately, so please don't worry about kind of trying to screen grab that or anything now. So we'll get that across to you, and you can look at those links and that information in your own time. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're just going to move in to try and get a bit of feedback from you now. I just want to thank our speakers again for the fantastic content today. That was brilliant. I hope everyone enjoyed that, and there's lots of questions in the chat. Obviously, we can't get to every single one of those, so apologies for that. If we could have the next slide, please. A couple of poll questions coming up for you now. So just reflecting back on your scores at the earlier part of the session here. If you could rate your understanding of the subject again now, that would be great. Let's have a look, see what's coming up. So first response there, that's looking positive. We've moved kind of from that middle ground towards the upper end of that with option 4. So a lot more people are informed. We've got some really high scores there in 5 as well. So that's fantastic. Great. Okay. Lovely, well done. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide, please, which is another poll question for us. So what else would you like us to cover in future learning programs to support your housing and regeneration delivery? Let's see if we'll get any initial responses there. So BNG seems to be kind of coming up in there as well, which is obviously a relevant issue at the moment. Planning conditions, some specifics there about gypsy and traveller sites, community assets, appeals, case studies, collaborative working, interpretation of the NPPF, housing funding. So yeah, we've got some great responses there. Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so that concludes today's session. We've finished just slightly early, so we can give you a bit of your valuable time back today. So thank you again, everyone, for all your contributions and to our speakers today. And have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you. Goodbye.